What we're looking at here is a federal statute, a federal statutory power designated or titled the Quarantine Act. This is the enactment which the federal ministers and the provincial ministers are standing under right now in order to draw their powers, their abilities, and their duties during this time of the corona epidemic or pandemic. When we look into the preamble of this statute, it describes to us what is the purpose of the statute. And it says that this is an act to prevent the introduction and spread of communicable diseases. So the coronavirus is a communicable disease, and this enactment is what the ministers are using to give them the rights and the powers which they are now exercising against the society. Let's take a little journey, a little voyage into this statutory power titled and designated the Quarantine Act to see who it applies to and in what situation it applies. Now, in the interpretation section, you find the word communicable disease, which means or is given the designation under the Act as a human disease that is caused by an infectious agent. Therefore, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, this applies to the Quarantine Act. So they have the right under this Act to use the powers and designations that are described therein. Now let's look at the word conveyance. This means a watercraft, aircraft, train, motor vehicle, trailer, or other means of transportation, including a cargo container that arrives in Canada or is in the process of departing from Canada. So therein lies the legal obligation or the legal qualification. What does this conveyance have to be doing in order to be subjected to the Quarantine Act? This conveyance has to be either arriving in Canada or departing from Canada. Now, when you read further into this enactment, health assessment, the word, it means an evaluation of the relevant medical history and travel history of a traveler. So there's the statutory creature, there's the statutory person to whom which this Quarantine Act applies. If you are a traveler, then this Quarantine Act applies. Now, if you go down to the word traveler, you see the definition is as such. A traveler means a person, including the operator of a conveyance, who arrives in Canada or who is in the process of departing from Canada. So the same legal obligation. If you're a traveler, if you're in a conveyance, and you're departing from Canada, or you are entering Canada, then you are subject to this Quarantine Act and the conditions that the ministers have been placing under this enactment. As we continue to look into this enactment, we see in Section 5, subsection 1, it says the minister may designate qualified persons or classes of qualified persons as analysts, screening officers, or environmental health officers. So here we have three classes of persons being created. They said as analysts, screening officers, or environmental health officers. So you got to take note and remember that there's three classes of beings being created, which we're going to see how they're going to be used later on in the enactment. Furthermore, the minister may designate medical practitioners or other qualified healthcare practitioners or classes of such persons as quarantine officers. So if you're going to be quarantined, you have to have an officer over you. And here they're telling us who will become the quarantine officers. In Article 5, subsection 2, it reads as follows. The minister may designate medical practitioners or other qualified health care practitioners or classes of such persons as quarantine officers. So you draw your own conclusion what or classes of such persons refer to as it pertains to quarantine officers. So far we have four classes of persons or four statutory powers or four statutory beings being brought into operation or being brought into existence during this pandemic. They are analysts, screening officers, environmental health officers, and quarantine officers. Now, each one of these statutory persons or statutory beings will be designated or assigned certain duties and certain powers during this COVID-19 pandemic. In Article 5.3, there's another statutory being brought forth. It says that the minister may designate medical practitioners as review officers. So these individuals will be the ones who review whatever it is that they're going to be reviewed. Maybe they're going to review if you're allowed to go home, if you're allowed to be removed from quarantine, or review your situation. We're not really told exactly what it is. But look at the next one. It says 6.1. The minister may establish a quarantine station at any place in Canada. Okay, now this is interesting because here's a statutory power now, and it's clearly saying in Article 6.1 that the minister can create a quarantine station. It's just a polite way of saying a quarantine camp, a quarantined off section, a place that is in isolation away from society. This is what the statutory power is declaring, or giving the minister the duty and the right to accomplish the actions that are set forth within that article of law itself, 6.1, that says the minister may create a quarantine station. So thereby, the statutory being, the person, the individual who's playing the role of the minister, has now been granted the power to create a quarantine station, or create a place to isolate people, like we saw with the people coming off the ships originally when they were sick. In Ontario, they quarantined them at the Army, Trenton Base, I think exactly that's where it was. But this is exactly what's going on. These people, these individuals, they were considered travelers under the enactment. They were entering into Canada, and therefore they were subjected to the Quarantine Act and the powers that the ministers have been invoking under the Quarantine Act. That's why they were quarantined once they came off the cruise ships and they were flown back to Canada under this enactment. But again, who did it apply to? It applied to a traveler who was using a conveyance to get into Canada. And up till now, we have seen that this Quarantine Act applies to one statutory creature. That statutory creature being the traveler. The traveler who was entering or departing Canada through a conveyance was subject to the Quarantine Act. However, now, in Section 47, we're going to see that the legislator began to open up this enactment so that it no longer only applies to a traveler. In Section 47.1, it reads as follows: a quarantine officer or an environmental health officer, those two statutory creatures, may, to determine whether a conveyance or place or any contents within it could be the source of a communicable disease, or whether a traveler has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors, and to enforce the act, they can be enter and inspect the conveyance or any place where the conveyance has been, open and examine any cargo, container, baggage, package, or thing. So if you drove across the border and you came back recently in your conveyance and you entered into Canada and you parked your conveyance at home, and a few weeks later you started feeling sick, and hopefully not, but you did obtain the coronavirus, and now it's spreading in your household, this enactment, this quarantine enactment, gives them the right, under the warrant of a court, to come to your place and inspect to see if a communicable disease is outbreaking in your home, in your apartment complex. However, according to the enactment, the only statutory creature that they can quarantine or cause to take tests under this general powers is the traveler, because E and F grants them the right to do that. So even if they were to come to your place and subsequent family members were infected, they could not use the Quarantine Act in order to cause them to be sent to a quarantine station. In the past few weeks, we have seen police at interprovincial borders here in Canada. When you're trying to cross province to province, there are police that are gently intercepting you right now, asking you where you've been, if you've traveled, if anyone is sick around you. Eventually, I'm expecting them to be having thermometers and be looking for symptoms of people with COVID-19, the coronavirus. And if you have symptoms of that virus, then you most likely will be quarantined, sent to a quarantine station, put into isolation. I really only expect that degree of regulation to take place if there's an exponential growth of the virus within the country. So if we start seeing millions of people catching the virus and maybe a million or more people dying, then yeah, this is going to get really, really tight, and people are going to be quarantined in a quarantine station in isolation in order to prevent further spread. But as now, no, it doesn't look like that's the case right now. But things can change. So here in Article 20 is how the legislator is getting the ability to allow the ministers to operate this enactment upon all persons in the country. It says in Article 20, a quarantine officer may require any person at an entry or departure point to undergo a health assessment if the quarantine officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that a person has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable disease or who is infested with vectors. So let's break that down. A quarantine officer could be a police officer or also could be a soldier. And these officers, these quarantine officers, they can require any person at an entry or departure point to undergo a health assessment if they suspect that you've been in contact with someone who has had the coronavirus. So whatever parameters they're going to put on you being in contact with someone who had the coronavirus, whether they track you with your phone and say someone in the shopping mall had the coronavirus, you were there they could look at the phone records using the new app that they have and track your movements and say you were present at this time when a person with the coronavirus was there. Therefore, we suspect you may have caught it and you are an asymptomatic carrier, and we want you to undergo a health assessment, and that health assessment could lead you to being quarantined in isolation in one of these quarantine stations. So here we're seeing that a quarantine officer may require any person at an entry or departure point. Now, automatically, some people might assume that the entry and departure point actually means entry and departure of Canada in this situation, but it doesn't. We have to go to Article 9, where it says the minister may order by designation any point in Canada as an entry point. The entry and departure points that are being referred to here in Article 20 are the interprovincial borders that have been designated that by the minister. Now, the quarantine officer here in Article 20 may require any person. Notice the subject or player has changed. It's no longer a traveler, but it's a person. And that person, if he's at an entry or departure point, they could be subject to a health assessment. Again, so any person at an entry point or departure point can be subject to a health assessment. Now, they go further on in Article 20, subsection 2, that the word traveler now includes any person required to undergo a health assessment under subsection 1, what we just read. So you see how they change the definition of traveler in this small section here to include any person, anybody in their vehicle that's intercepted. So you're going to be passing through the interprovincial checkpoints. The police officers are going to be operating as quarantine officers. They might subject you to a health assessment. Then you'll have to go for a medical examination. And that medical examination is going to be at your expense. In Article 23, subsection 3 of this Quarantine Act, it states the examination shall be at the traveler's expense and shall be conducted in the place where the traveler is detained. Article 26. If a quarantine officer, after the medical examination of a traveler, has reasonable grounds to believe that the traveler has or might have a communicable disease, may order the traveler to comply with treatment or any other measure for preventing the introduction and spread of the communicable disease. Well, what other measure would they be talking about? The quarantine station, the quarantine isolation. There can be a number of different measures taken, but this article of law opens up the ability for them to create quarantine stations, camps like we saw in China, camps like we saw in growing up in America. They're doing their best, but I'm just saying, beds next to one another where the disease can spread. These quarantine stations, these quarantine camps, can be erected under this operation of law. The entry and departure points that have been placed by the minister are provincial right now. However, that can get squeezed down and placed by cities or by municipalities. They can designate entry and exit points by municipalities and by cities. And you will be subjected to the same operation of law that we are seeing here on the provincial level. In Section 28 of the Quarantine Act, it states that a quarantine officer may detain any traveler who, Section B, has been required to undergo a medical examination. So if you're assessed in your vehicle, or if you're out there and you're assessed at a point of entry and departure, and they suspect that you have the coronavirus, and they require you to undergo a medical examination, they're going to detain you. They can detain you. It's their right under this enactment, under this statutory power. The quarantine officer in subsection D has the right to detain any traveler who has or might have a communicable disease or has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable disease. So again, if you had been out there in the public and they use that app to track your phone and they see that you were close to someone who had the disease, well, this gives them the right to detain you. If they suspect that you were in close proximity to a person who has the coronavirus, then they're going to suspect that you have been infected and you're asymptomatic, and then subsection D2 applies, that you are capable of infecting another person. And again, there, another power, another capability to detain you and to remove your freedom. And what do they want? What do they want? I'm not sure. What can they do? They can put you into a quarantine camp. We saw in Wuhan, China, that they had points of entry and departure in the neighborhoods. So the police put up gates, and there was the Communist Party, China, the army. They had representatives standing there, and that was considered an entry and departure point, and they had their own regulations concerning their points. Well, this enactment, this regulation, gives the authorities, the ministers here in Canada, to create such entry and departure points. When you take the time to read the Quarantine Act, you're going to see something very particular, that these powers, these duties, this enactment has been brought forth to operate for the public good. It operates strictly on a civil level, under civil rights, which is good to know because we understand what that means. The Emergencies Act that Justin Trudeau has recently been speaking about, if you read the preamble of the Emergencies Act, therein lies your right as an individual, your rights and your freedoms. Even during a time of emergency, as I've taught before, the government is not allowed to limit and abridge your fundamental rights and freedoms, your natural rights, when you understand what they are. It doesn't mean that the government is not going to try and do it. And in a point of emergency, when things are in the heat of fire, it's not the time to try to stand on the authority that you know is right. When the time is when things have calmed down, you can go back and say, hey, you put into measures things that limited and abridged my rights, and you weren't supposed to do that, even for the greater good of the civil or the public. I'm not going to get into the attributes of the virus and what I believe is or is not happening with the virus. However, as you've seen, this statutory power grants the government a lot of abilities that they wouldn't necessarily have without this extraordinary situation transpiring. And the powers that they have and that they're exercising are very detrimental to freedoms of individuals. So this is a time to be careful and to be wary. You don't really want to find yourself in a situation where the powers that are in operation under this Quarantine Act are being exercised against you. So with this brief video, I described what those powers will be and what the individuals exercising those powers will be out there doing. So therefore, you can take a plan of action accordingly and protect you and your family. If this virus starts to replicate and infect more people, and it's necessary for them to create a tighter lockdown upon the society, where the entry and exit points are now no longer provincial, this is the time that I'm trying to say that it's not a good time to be out there in society or in the public. Let's hope that it doesn't get to that point, but we don't know right now with what we're battling. This is only the first wave. We know that novel viruses, new viruses, when they tend to hit humanity, they come in several waves, not just one wave. So we're seeing the first wave now, and we shall see a second wave indefinitely. And if you study history concerning the Spanish flu, you'll see that the second wave that came was more devastating than the first wave. So we need to be wary about that. What I'm not declaring is that we're going to be locked down by the government, by the soldiers, by the army, by the police. We're going to be intercepted and thrown into quarantine camps everywhere we go. Please don't think that's what I'm saying. But in reality, when we look at the Quarantine Act, those operations of law, those powers do exist and can be used against the society if they deem it necessary. And to some degree or another, they are already exercising those powers by placing interprovincial points of entry and departure within Canada, and thereby granting the police the powers under the Quarantine Act to act as health assessment officers. Now, we've seen on the news media recently that they've been talking about Canada looking into using that app to track the phones and to see the movements of the people that they intercept. If they do that, then that Quarantine Act, Article 28, is going to be very, very bad, because they'll be able to say, we tracked your phone, we saw you were in close contact with someone who has the coronavirus, has been confirmed, therefore we want a medical assessment against you. This medical assessment you will have to pay for, and you can be detained by the quarantine officer until you have the medical assessment. If the medical assessment comes back positive, or if they suspect that you're an asymptomatic carrier of the disease, then they could potentially quarantine you in a quarantine station or a quarantine camp in isolation, according to the powers that are in operation under the Quarantine Act. Again, this is not what I'm declaring will happen, but the power to do this does exist.